Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Doctrine, Dogma, and Davide podcast. My name is Davide O.P, and today we have a very special guest. This is Father Philip Neri Reese, who is one of my professors here at the Angelicum. Now, Father, if you want to just say a few words and introduce yourself.
Sure, yeah. So first, just let me say thank you for the invitation to come on the podcast. So as Davide said, my name is Father Philip Neri Reese. I am both the director of the Angelicum Thomistic Institute and also one of the professors of philosophy here at the Angelicum, or the Pontifical University of St. Thomas. And so I should, by way of warning and caveat, just say that though most of what I teach at the Angelicum is in the field of ethics, my particular expertise actually is in Thomistic metaphysics. But a Thomist really should be able to do all things, and so you can consider this discussion to be my modest attempt to at least live out that axiom.
Yeah, and I think that both of us are people that like to just study everything and talk a lot, quite frankly, so we could definitely go in a lot of different directions. But one thing that I really wanted to discuss was something we actually talked about in our social ethics class, which is the sort of roles of men and women within marriage. And of course, we talk about the fact that that there is a headship that the husband exercises over the wife, and everything like that. But one thing that you argue for is that there is not really any sort of there's not really any particular obligation of like the man to be like the breadwinner or the provider. Or for the woman to like stay home and be with the children. And while I agree with you to an extent, I think that when I read the Church's magisterium and a lot of these sources, it does give me the impression that there is at least some sort of like normative rule or something going on. And so I wanted to sort of dive into that a little bit.
Sure, yeah. So it's a good topic. It's a big topic. One just little point of clarification, right, is the point that I made in class is that it's very, very difficult to try to assign any kind of social roles like being the breadwinner, which you just mentioned, as a consequence of natural law, right?
Okay.
So for example, now I think in fact the Church's magisterium does not teach that the man needs to be the breadwinner and the woman needs to stay at home or something like that. But even if it were the case that the Church's magisterium did definitively teach such a thing, that wouldn't at all impact the question of whether or not one could derive that this is true from the natural law. In the contexts of the classes that I teach at the Angelicum, my task is to do philosophical ethics as opposed to theological ethics, and so the task for me is to identify what can you give philosophically rigorous demonstrations of, and what can't you? And so my claim in particular is just this, that certain kinds of very common, even cross-culturally common social roles might not be derivable from the natural law. So for example, I don't think it's derivable from the natural law that the man should be the breadwinner. I don't think it's derivable from the natural law that the man needs to be the sort of physical protector, right? Even if it might be the case that that we have really good reason to think in cross-cultural and diachronic ways that most men probably would be better suited to fulfilling those roles.
Right. Yeah. But when doing natural philosophy, a lot of like you have made many arguments that do rely on just like men being in general better suited to a particular task. And so if you're going to say like, oh, well, men might be better suited to be the physical protectors of the family, but that doesn't mean that that they have a particular obligation to do so. That seems to me that would seem to undermine a lot of other arguments that you would make in natural philosophy.
I think it just depends. You'd need to look at the arguments. So for example, take something like so we always want to start with the biology, right?
Right.
And perhaps even the psychology, right?
Right.
Especially insofar as psychology is grounded in some way in biology, brain chemistry, etc.
Right.
And so it is simply an indisputable fact of human biology, right? That men tend, on the whole, to be bigger and stronger, right? And that's that's not something pejorative to say against the female physique, right? And it's also not something that that one could claim would therefore make something like a physically powerful woman a monstrosity, right? That's just not the case, right? However, right, you can say something like this: if you live in a society where there is not reliable rule of law, and because you lived in such a society, there was on a day-to-day basis a level of physical threat and danger to the physical survival of the family, then you could say, normatively speaking, the role of protector is going to go to the father.
Okay.
Now, when we look kind of cross-culturally and diachronically, is it the case that the vast majority of human cultures have lived in a state of war and lacking rule of law? That one's disputable, right? But so you can at least say this, that that in countries and civilizations where there is rule of law and your life is not physically threatened on a day-to-day basis, the claim that protector of the family is a role determined for the father to embody and fulfill by nature is just too strong, right? It's that's going a bit too far, and so I think it's the sort of thing, mutatis mutandis. You can say the same thing about breadwinner, right? So a lot of it is historically sensitive without being relativistic.
Right. Yeah. I mean, what I would say to that is that essentially, like, if you live in a society where, let's say, your life is not in danger on a day-to-day basis, that to me does not undermine the role of, like, say a husband as sort of like the protector of his wife. It just means that there's not a danger to protect her from in that given instance. Like the fact that the husband might have a role to be the protector of his wife and of his family, to me, that doesn't mean that if there's not something to be protected from at any given moment, that therefore the role no longer exists. It's still, I would say, it still exists in potency.
Sure, I grant that it exists in potency, but as soon as you say that it exists in potency, you're saying that it does not exist in act.
I suppose.
So if you grant me that, then nolo contendere.
Okay, but then you could still then say that the husband does have an obligation as the protector of the family whenever there is danger to be protected from, right?
Well, no, that's a bit too much, right?
Okay.
Because so look, let me give you an example. So suppose a husband and a wife are taking their children, live in a society where there is rule of law, right? Like, there's the father doesn't, in actuality, right, in act, have a kind of standing exercise of protector role. And, husband, wife, and children are out and about enjoying, the day off in Italy on the day of Epiphany.
Right.
And a child, one of their children is, in danger of being run over by a car, right? And the father is further away than the wife, right? In that moment, the wife doesn't need to determine whether the protector of the family allows her to go protect the child, right? In that circumstance, the parents have an obligation to protect their kids, right? And
Right, yeah.
if the kid is in danger, right? It's let me put it this way: the following would be, I think, a ridiculous notion, or a ridiculous analysis of what's going on in the moment. It's not as if, in that moment, the father's role as protector is actualized, but because he's too far away from the child, therefore, automatically by force of natural law, he delegates his office of protector of the child to the wife, and therefore, as a minister of his role of protector, the wife saves the life of the child from the incoming car. That's just not what's happening, right? I think we should distinguish between having the task of protecting a child in a given circumstance from the societal role of protector, right? And you only have the role of protector when you live in a society where habitually your family's life is in danger, right? Or at least habitually, it's not unreasonable to think that there needs protecting, right? In roughly the same way that you only have the role of breadwinner if you live in a social and economic context in which it's reasonable to expect on a habitual basis that bread needs to be won, right? If you happen to be born into a radically socialist or radically communistic society in which bread is just delivered to you, right? The needs, the basic needs of the family are simply given by the state, right? In that case, I think, like you earlier said, the role of breadwinner is going to be reduced to an office that's in potency, not in act.
I see. Okay. So then let's move on a little bit from sort of the natural philosophy side and take a look at, I think, a little bit more at some of the things that the church has had to say on it. Because when I read the church's magisterium, and you've watched the episode that I did on submission and headship and working wives and everything, and I'll link that video down in the description. So if you want to watch that and come back, feel free. But I responded to people like Tim Gordon that will cite passages from the magisterium that say things like women should work primarily in the home or in its immediate vicinity, or another citation that he'll cite is the Catechism of the Council of Trent, saying that wives should love to stay at home, only going out for necessity. And where I think that they go wrong in that interpretation is that they'll read the magisterium saying, women should generally work primarily in the home and be primarily with the children, and then conclude from that, women are prohibited from working outside the home ever under any circumstances. But I don't, and while I think that it's wrong to conclude that, I think that it would also be wrong to interpret it in such a way as it doesn't actually mean anything. There is no primary obligation of women to be at home with the children. And so I guess I want to sort of get your take on that.
Sure. So, largely I agree with your interpretation of the magisterial documents. And in particular, in the earlier episode, one of the points that you made that I think was to the good and very accurate, right, is understanding what the socioeconomic conditions were when the magisterial teaching was given, right? So when the magisterium of the Holy Father teaches that that it should be sort of absolutely prohibited that women be compelled to work outside the home, right? The socioeconomic context. So first, that's a very widely understandable kind of prohibition,
right?
That again is not a prohibition against women working outside the home. It's a prohibition against having a social order where they would be compelled to do so. And you rightly pointed out that especially when the conditions are such that working outside the home would mean working, dangerous factory work with extremely long hours and, making it virtually impossible for a woman to fulfill her role as mother, right? So I completely agree with you in both your claim that that what the magisterium is teaching is not that women working is something that's contrary to natural law or prohibited, but rather that that what's really evil, right, and really problematic from the perspective of Catholic social thought is living in a society where such a thing would be de facto compulsory.
Right.
Now, maybe this is more what you were going towards in light of the comment that I made earlier, which is that certain kinds of functions need to be taken sort of on a case-by-case basis.
Mm-hmm.
So here is one that I think you can give a natural law sort of argument that at least normatively women are the caregivers of children, the primary caregivers of children in infancy, right? So there's just an obvious biological connection between mother and offspring, right?
Especially since in the early years of infancy, absent modern technology, a man literally cannot feed the child.
Yeah, that's right. There's and that's not attending to all of the child developmental psychology data that we have about the importance of maternal care, maternal touch, all of those kinds of things. So I do think you can give a natural law argument for that role of primary caregiver in infancy belonging normatively to women, right? From which again it doesn't follow that therefore in every instance where you have a woman who's not the primary caregiver of a child in infancy, something has gone wrong, right? It's not like it's contrary to natural law to have a wet nurse, right? But this would be contrary to natural law, right? To try to construct a society where normatively you have wet nurses, and only extraordinarily do you have women be the primary caregiver of their own children in infancy, right? That I do think you can show is contrary to natural law. And so I take it that that the magisterial teaching that you were mentioning in this case is a case where what the magisterium is teaching is not something that we can know only through faith, but it's also something that we can know through reason.
Okay. Well, that's definitely good because, when I was sort of like listening in your class and as well as reading sort of like what the magisterium has to say, I think I perhaps I misunderstood what you were trying to express because I think that, it's one thing to sort of like draw distinctions in the magisterium and to say like, oh, well, this is not what they're saying, that it doesn't mean this. But, at the end of the day, like that, it has to be saying something. Yeah. And so when people try to just sort of like explain away, oh, like, that doesn't mean anything, that's where I sort of have issue. It's just like, well, he wouldn't say it if it didn't mean anything, and so that there has to be at least some sort of normative rule whereby like, women do sort of have a primary obligation to be like, at home with the children and be the caregivers. But exactly what that looks like is going to vary from society to society.
Yes, and can in fact can vary pretty widely, right? So,
exactly.
So note, for example, I hope I was being careful in the way that I phrased things in my earlier answer to you, right? So I think it's demonstrable from the natural law that women have the role of being primary caregiver in infancy, right, to their children, right? But once a child is, for example, like no longer breastfeeding, right, et cetera, then I do think it's there's allowance for societal and cultural variability, right? So you could have a case or multiple cases in which either the husband or the grandparents or some, it's allowable for there to be other social configurations where, perhaps after infancy, the primary caregiver is not normatively the mother, right? So what we wouldn't want is somebody to sort of draw too much from the or attempt to draw from the natural law what isn't there to be even in potency to be drawn, like, for example, concluding that therefore either the social practices of Victorian England, or you might even have someone who's more radical than that and think, no, Victorian England, the mother is still kind of too remote. You have to in fact have like the wife at home all the time, doing literally everything, for the kids on a day-to-day basis. That, like, of course, that's right. That is a possible, way too far. Right? It's possible to have a society like that, and it's possible to have a very beautiful, very holy, very good family like that. But it's not a requirement of the natural law, right? Whereas, at least in a normative way. Whereas I am willing to make the stronger claim with respect to the care of children in infancy. That I really do think that that if you attempt to construct a society in which the primary caregiver of a child in infancy is someone other than the mother, in anything aside from an exceptional basis, then I really do think you've probably gone beyond the bounds of the natural law.
Okay. So then what do you make of, for instance, the various popes saying that, like, a woman's work should be primarily in the home or in its immediate vicinity then, like in Quadragesimo.
Sure. So I take them to be, so again, I'll do kind of something similar to what you did earlier, which is, so be attentive to the cultural context in which the teaching is made. Right. So, up until relatively recently, up until really just the past few decades, even in the sort of quote unquote developed West, it was very, very normal for women to have many children and to have children sort of across the majority of their married lives, right? Right. Which means you're talking about a social context in which the norm is for there
to be at least one infant.
There is an infant, right? So if you live in a society where that's the case, right? That just most married women tend to have an infant around. Then you don't need to introduce the kind of precision and nuance that I was doing earlier about being the primary caregiver in infancy versus not, because if the majority of the time there's an infant around, right? Then just to be the primary caregiver, full stop, is also to be the primary caregiver in infancy.
Right. Sure. Yeah, I think that's very fair. Recently, I started reading Pius XII's Dear Newlyweds, which is really, really good, a series of Wednesday audiences that he gave to newlywed couples. Yeah. And in it, he does talk about the fact that, like, listen, in the changing times, like, basically due to the rise of white-collar industries, essentially, women can actually be just as materially successful as a man, as like a doctor or a lawyer, all of these other white-collar professions. And like he doesn't condemn that at all, but he does sort of like portray it as like a moral hazard of like, don't forget your role as wife here, and don't let this confuse you about sort of the natural hierarchy of the marriage as well.
Yeah, I absolutely agree, and perhaps I think it might be worth mentioning also that something similar, though it's going to take a different shape, But something similar can be said on the part of the husband, right? That as culture develops, as technology develops, as our economic kind of situation develops, there are there are new shapes that the careers of men can take, right?
Mm-hmm.
Which also are going to bear with them certain threats and dangers that would have kind of remove them from the necessary proximity to the home that is required for them to fulfill their role as head of the family, right?
Right. Yeah.
And so so you can there are mutatis mutandis. There are things also to be said on the side of the husband.
Right. Yeah. If the husband is deployed overseas, is in the military, like that, there's a hazard there as well too. I think that's a really important point.
Yep, that's right. I mean, and just also, I mean, there are certain kinds of professions that at least present themselves as requiring a certain amount of time per week to be done, right? And I think it's a very good and very healthy thing for a Catholic man to, who is a husband and a father, to reflect on whether or not a particular career path will require an investment of time that is in fact antithetical to the successful execution of the office of husband and father.
Yeah, exactly. Especially that includes not just like, sort of the governing of his household, but also just like the care that he needs to give towards his wife and his children. And that's also something that Pius XII talks about in Dear Newlyweds, where he talks about the fact that like a husband getting home from a long day at work might be like tired and grumpy, and will be neglectful of like his wife's emotional needs and the care that he owes her, and so like a man who's at work all the time and doesn't really care for his wife, like there's something that's gone wrong there as well.
Yeah, that's exactly right. The phenomenon of sort of workaholism is something that is perhaps not even just still with us, right? But something that is in some respects on the rise, and I think in particular, just as a concrete example of a social change that that I think connects exactly with this point is the shift in recent years towards work from home kinds of configurations, because perhaps at first glance you might think, oh, work from home, that allows you to be more present to your family, that allows you to be kind of more plugged in and more attentive as a father. But actually, it seems like most of the recent studies are showing that what in fact happens is the reverse, is that when your job allows you to work from home, it actually becomes very difficult for you to ever
unplug,
feel like you're no longer on the clock. Right? And so if you're always on the clock, you're always in the headspace of working, and so it's a kind of imposed workaholism, which actually has the effect of making a husband and a father less connected with the family, because even though they're physically in the house, right, they're emotionally and psychologically unavailable, right? And that's exactly, I think, a very dangerous thing.
Yeah. Because like I think that to sort of like wrap up this conversation, I think that whether you're talking about the man or the woman, like in everything that they do, whether it's the man working, the woman working, like you have to remember, okay, like what is my role as the husband and father? What is my role as wife and mother?
Yeah.
And that there is either one can go too far and sort of like forgetting the fact that the work is for the sake of the family.
That's right. And maybe, I mean, before we shift topics, just one final thing that I should say is, my comments have been cagey in this sense, right? That I want to be very careful about what we can and can't prove from the natural law with respect to roles. But but I do want to have my last word be this, that no one, whether you're talking about the husband or the wife, the father or the mother, man or woman, no one should ever feel like they need to apologize for desiring and fulfilling traditional social roles, right?
Yeah.
There is nothing wrong or shameful or bad about, a young wife, a young mother wanting to stay at home with the kids, right? There is nothing wrong or shameful or bad or patriarchal about a young husband, a young father wanting to go out and be the main breadwinner for the family, right? The social conditions and the cultural context in which that allocation of roles really sort of was the most natural and the most normal is not all that distant from and disconnected from the cultural and the societal circumstances of today. And so it's perfectly fine if people want to fulfill, and play out those roles in their family life.
Yeah.
That's not something that any Catholic should ever feel like they need to apologize for or explain.
Right, yeah. And I think that I would go so far as to say in most cases that is still the most expedient and most prudent way to structure the marriage and the family.
Yeah, I agree.
All right, cool. So the next topic I really wanted to talk to you about is really the original topic that we were going to talk about last year when we first started trying to put this podcast together, but obviously you're too busy running the Thomistic Institute and slowly taking over the Angelicum, But I wanted to talk a little bit about subsidiarity because this is something that you have said that tons of really good faithful Catholics will get wrong, especially in the United States, because the general portrayal of subsidiarity is essentially, it gets portrayed as American-style federalism, which is not exactly what the Church understands by subsidiarity. And so I was hoping you could speak a little bit to that.
Yeah, sure, I can. And again, I should give a similar caveat as earlier, right? So political philosophy and political ethics are a little bit outside my main field of research, but on this point, I really do think there's a fairly widespread misconception among sort of American conservatives and in particular even among American Catholics. And there are a number of different ways in which this misconception you'll sometimes kind of encounter the misconception or see it play out. So one is the one that you mentioned, which is there's a sector of America, at least I'll say American Catholicism, where the principle of subsidiarity, which is a very important principle in Catholic social thought, is basically allied with something like the political understanding of American federalism.
Right.
Another case where you'll see the principle of subsidiarity invoked in ways that are, I think, at best misleading, would be in the debates among Catholics about the status of integralism. Right. So sometimes you'll see Catholic integralists invoke subsidiarity as a principle that either bolsters, or in sort of more in bolder contexts, right? It'll even be presented as a kind of principle that entails integralism, where integralism.
Could you just define?
Sure.
Integralism?
So integralism roughly is the view that that the political common good for the sake of which the political community exists is something that is subordinate to the supernatural common good, the care of which the Church has, in such a way that that the state, though distinct, really is always subordinate to the church. And so if there were, if you had a case where the church made a particular determination and the state made a different one, then the church's determination would trump the state. And so sometimes you'll, at least I can, just speaking for myself, sometimes I have encountered some, young and enthusiastic integralists who will say that, that no, this is just the principle of subsidiarity writ large, no longer thinking about the way that the polis relates to the family or the household, but also the way that the church relates to the state.
Right.
And so in fact, the principle of subsidiarity doesn't either aggregate to American federalism or to Catholic integralism. It's just an autonomous principle that is very important for Catholic social thought on its own terms.
Okay. So do you want to just define that principle, that principle of subsidiarity?
Sure. Let me start with the misconception, right? So the misconception goes something like this. Anything that can be done at a sort of lower level should be done at a lower level. So if there's something that the family can do, then the state shouldn't do it, right? If there's something that, to speak in a kind of American context, if there's something that a state can do, then the federal government shouldn't do that. And that is far and away the most common misrepresentation of the principle of subsidiarity. That's not what it says. What the principle of subsidiarity really teaches is this, that whenever a higher and sort of more all-encompassing community aids a community that's narrower in focus, that sort of exists under that broader umbrella, the aid from above always needs to be given in a way that respects the proper offices and goals or ends of the lower level communities. So let's take sort of the state and the family, right? So it's not saying that the state can't do any of the things that are proper to the family, right? It's like, for example, educate children. What it's saying is that when the state aids in the education of children, which is one of the proper ends of the family, it has to do so in a way that respects the proper tasks, offices, functions, and goals of the family. And those two formulations, the misrepresentation and then the real principle, can lead to really importantly different conclusions about what ought to be done in kind of political society and what can be done.
Right. And so, like, as an example, for instance, you brought up education. It is totally acceptable for the state to intervene in the education of children in the sense of, like, providing for public schools or mandating that certain educational benchmarks be met by every child. But it would be an overstep or a violation of subsidiarity to say the only place that a child may be educated is at our state schools, and that the parents cannot determine, say, to send them to a Catholic school or to like develop some homeschool program that would also fulfill the end of educating the child, right?
Yeah, that's right. So to use as a kind of a classic Greek example, famously or infamously in the Republic, in the dialogue The Republic, Plato sort of imagines this society that he presents as a kind of utopia where the education of children is forcefully taken away from the parents, right? And it's done in a communal way by the state, and then in the early books of Aristotle's Politics, he subjects this kind of Platonic, almost communist ideal of
Right.
childhood education to pretty withering critique. And largely speaking, the critique that Aristotle gives there is something that is, if not explicitly expressive of, at least anticipatory of something like the principle of subsidiarity, which is to say this: it is the proper role of the family, of the household, to educate children.
Right.
And so if the state is going to aid in the education of children in a way that just violently takes the education of children away from the family, where the family really is trying to educate the child, then you've got a violation of this principle.
Right.
But let me give you a second example of a case where there's not a violation of the principle. So we've just said that it's the proper role or office of the family to educate children. And so if the state is going to aid in the education of children, then it has to do so in a way that's sort of respectful of the way that properly belongs to the family. Suppose you've got we'll call it an educationally abusive family, where neither father nor mother cares about educating their kids, right? And so they don't do any kind of homeschooling. They don't send the kids to private school. They don't send the kids to public school, right?
That's actually a trend now. It's called unschooling.
Unschooling.
Yeah,
okay. News to me, but I live inside a cloister. So take a case like that. So if unschooling just means exactly what I just described, right? Then you can imagine a scenario where the state steps in and and ensures that, assigns a social worker, right, to make sure that those kids are at least going to public school each day, right? In that case, you don't have a violation of the principle of subsidiarity. Why? Because the state isn't disrespecting the office and the function of the family. What the state is doing in that case is recognizing that a particular family, this family in particular, is, for whatever reason, not fulfilling its proper duties and obligations.
Right.
And for the good of the children, right, they still need to be educated. So since these parents and this household aren't doing their job, then the state intervenes and gives aid for the education of the family. So that's a case where you have even something like a violent intervention, right? It might be against the will of the unschooling father and mother, what the state is doing, but it's not a violation of subsidiarity. Why? Because subsidiarity is always attentive to what is the proper purpose or telos or goal of the community, the end of the community. And are particular communities actually working towards that goal? And if not, then the state is perfectly within its rights to intervene.
Right. So just going back to sort of like what you described as a mistaken notion of subsidiarity, which is the idea that anything that can be done sort of at a more local level should be done at a more local level. Whatever can be done by the state should be done by the state. Whatever can be done by the county should be done by the county, family, town, like whatever the case may be. I know that a lot of people will appeal to Pius XI's encyclical, again, Quadragesimo Anno, where he says that, just as it would be wrong to remove by violence a person's, or to take on what a person could do for himself, it is wrong to take from a more local community what it can achieve on its own and assign it to a higher community. I don't have the exact quotation memorized here, but it seems like Pius XI is actually expressing what you described as a mistaken notion of subsidiarity. So how do you sort of reconcile that?
Yeah, so it will be unsurprising to either you or your listeners that I don't think that what he's saying is contrary, is an expression of the mistaken view, nor do I think it's contrary to what the authentic principle of subsidiarity says.
Right.
So I think one of the things that's important to recognize is that in the vast majority of the discussions of the principle of subsidiarity, you have a multiplicity of different communities, right? That have wider or narrower in the scope of what their purpose or their end or their goal is.
Right.
And so the principle, properly speaking, it's not a principle that holds only between, say, the state understood not in an American sense of like the state of Maryland or the state of Texas, but
the state understood as like the nation.
Yes, yeah. Or in an Aristotelian political context, the polis, right? Yeah. So the principle holds not just between polis and family, right? But for any kinds of intermediary communities. And so it's a very important point to recognize that all those kinds of intermediate communities, those don't necessarily have a function. I'm going to use a technical Aristotelian word that we've used in class, but it's very helpful and it's very important, which is so the adjective is architectonic. So something is architectonic if it is right to think of it as in some way kind of collecting, guiding, and fitting together a plurality of different things with a view to some kind of common goal or common end. So you can think of one example that I like to use in class is you can think of the conductor of an orchestra. His task is architectonic with respect to any of the particular instruments in the orchestra and the particular instrumentalists within the orchestra, precisely because it's his job to coordinate all of their different proper activities, right? So there are lots of big, so to speak, kind of high level, wide scope communities that are nevertheless not architectonic communities. They're not kind of coordinating communities, right?
Right.
So you can think of, so like Google, right, is a huge community, right, that has care for a lot of different sub-communities sort of that fall under it, including even to some extent families in this sense, right, that Google pays the wages and the salaries for, that families need in order to survive. But Google doesn't have it as its end or goal to successfully coordinate all of those kind of lower level communities with a view towards the common good. Whereas the polis, in an Aristotelian sense, does coordinate with a view towards the common good. So the first thing to say is that if you're talking about a higher level community that is not architectonic, i.e. not sort of coordinating with a view towards a higher good, then those higher communities really shouldn't take, so to speak, take over any of the roles of and offices of the lower level communities. with respect to architectonic communities, or kind of communities that coordinate with a view towards a higher goal, there you can have the community take over a role, as long as it takes over the role only in a way that is respectful of the proper office.
Right.
So for example, with respect to the encyclical that you mentioned, I would simply distinguish that there are two ways in which the state might take, what's proper to something that falls under it. Mm-hmm. One way is in a way that fails to respect that it in fact is proper to the lower level community, like the family, mm-hmm. And that always respects that. But there's another way, another sense in which you can talk about an architectonic community like the state taking over, mm-hmm. And that's kind of more like Plato's Republic, right? Where it takes away from, right? So maybe you might say something like this: let's distinguish between taking over in certain cases a role proper to the lower level, mm-hmm. versus taking a role away from the proper level. Yeah. I take it that what the Holy Father is condemning is the latter, not the former, mm-hmm. right? Yeah. So a very simple way to get at the same point would just be this. I think it would be crazy to interpret the Holy Father as saying something like, if there's a famine and a particular family or village or something could hypothetically figure out a way to provide at least minimum sustenance for themselves, then therefore it would be wrong for the state to come in and guide the way in which sort of like food is produced. Mm-hmm. It seems to me obvious that he's not trying to prohibit something like that, right? But if it's something like this, imagine a case where hypothetically a centralized state came in, there's no famine, right? Mm-hmm. But it decides that it's going to take away from the village and the household the decision of how daily needs are going to be met, including like for food and drink. Mm-hmm. And it's going to provide a kind of central, say, hypothetically 5-year plan, right? Where the state micromanages all of that in such a way where it takes away the role of procuring the daily necessities of life, which is proper to the household or the family. Right. Then I think you've got a really clear case of exactly what the Holy Father was condemning in his magisterium.
Yeah, I remember when I first asked you about it last year in class, you said something that I've said a couple of times on my podcast. You said that when we read the magisterium of the Church, it is always important that we interpret it in such a way as the magisterium would not be saying something obviously false.
Yes, yeah, that's right.
And that's such a fantastic principle.
It's a good hermeneutic principle. Yes.
Exactly. And the example you gave at the time was like, if you interpret Pius XI in sort of that absolute sense, then he would be saying, for instance, that it is morally wrong for a father to help his son if his son can do something on his own.
Right.
And that's just obviously false.
Yes. Yeah, that's exactly right. Yeah, absolutely right.
And so I've continued to sort of like appeal to that principle whenever I like face difficulties in the magisterium. And I think that's, honestly, it's something that I think people get in trouble with when it comes to interpreting the Second Vatican Council, where they'll like, you'll have sort of more progressive Catholics and more like radical traditionalist Catholics, both interpreting Vatican II in a way that is inconsistent with what the church taught prior. But whereas the more ultra-traditionalists will say it's different and that's bad, the progressives will say it's different but that's good.
Right.
And it's just like, I think that you have to make sure that you're always interpreting the magisterium. You have to have an understanding that is consistent, not just with what the church says now, and not just with what the church said then, but is consistent as much as possible with everything the church has said.
That's right.
Past, present, and future, you know?
Yes, yeah, I completely agree. And I think, in many respects that touches on, one of the fundamental convictions that, our university is committed to, and certainly, one of the central elements of St. Thomas's teaching is the coherence of truth, right?
Yeah.
That the truth never contradicts itself. Right. And so that's true whether you're talking about magisterial and revealed truth across time. It's also true whether you're comparing, say, philosophical and theological truth. When you're comparing truths that can be known by faith versus by reason, right?
Right. Yeah.
That if you've come up with an interpretation of some magisterial document that has it just contradicting either a slew of other magisterial documents or the fundamental dogmas of the faith, right?
Right.
Or if your interpretation of a magisterial document has it contradicting some truth that is knowable through the God-given light of reason, right? Then something has gone wrong. Right.
You've made a mistake somewhere.
Exactly. And so I do think it's a good kind of litmus test or rule of thumb to just kind of take a step back, especially when certain kind of interpretive debates are getting heated, right? But to take a step back and just kind of calmly and coolly ask ourselves, the interpretation that I was about to commit myself to, does it have any really obvious counterexamples?
Right. Yeah.
And if it does, then maybe I should have the humility to sort of step back and say, I need to think about that a little bit more.
I think that's a vulnerability that I've noticed. I think really smart people, especially, tend to fall into, because a lot of times people that are really, really bright, they're usually aware of how bright they are. And so that they'll end up following a train of thought down a rabbit hole, and they'll just miss something completely obvious.
Yes.
And they'll sort of get so caught up with sort of their own cleverness that they miss something that is perfectly obvious. And when it's pointed out to them, they think, oh, but other than that, it all makes so much sense.
Right.
So like I've got to just sort of like dismiss that point,
Yeah, and I think the danger there is that sometimes you have people. At least among philosophers, there's this phrase, people who are caught in the throes of a theory, right? So they've come up with, their theory, their interpretation, right? And it works for A, B, C, D, E, and F, right? And so they've convinced themselves that they've got it figured out. And, but when you point out Z, that obviously doesn't fit the theory, then they're so caught up in their own kind of idea that sort of horrifyingly that sometimes they're just willing to bite the bullet and accept that it doesn't fit with Z, right? And that's where I think to your earlier point, that's where progressive Catholics are just willing to accept that this thing that they think is required by the spirit of Vatican II just contradicts the creed, right? And they'll bite the bullet, or you'll have a traditionalist who a kind of radical traditionalist, right? I mean, I'm a traditionalist, but a sort of radical traditionalist who has come up with this this theory of conscience, right? And then when it's pointed out that that their theory is inconsistent with magisterial teaching like the Second Vatican Council, but also, for example, magisterial teaching like the First Vatican Council.
Right. Yeah.
And it turns out that they're actually advocating for something like fideism, right, which is
Right.
a condemned heresy.
Yeah.
They're just willing to bite the bullet and say, yeah, look, Vatican II, gone, right?
Right. Yeah.
And even, Vatican I gone, right?
Right, yeah.
And they'll just kind of push back on the timeline
Yeah.
when the great apostasy happened,
Yeah. Exactly.
right?
Yeah.
But yeah, this is, if you find yourself in a situation where that's a temptation, red flag.
Yeah.
It's
exactly.
likely what has gone wrong is the way that you're thinking about it and the theory that you've come up with,
Yeah.
not the magisterial teaching of the church across time,
Yeah.
or the compatibility of faith and reason.
Yeah, exactly. I very recently read an article from Where Peter Is, which the title of the article, what the church no longer teaches about Ephesians. And I was just like, okay, hold on a second. Like, the church's teachings don't change.
Right.
Like, we can change in how we express and understand certain aspects of the church's magisterium. A less problematic title might have been what the church no longer says in its expression of Ephesians.
Yeah, how the church no longer expresses herself. Right.
Exactly. But like they actually did exactly what you talked about, which is just sort of like biting the bullet of like, yeah, the church used to be wrong. And as an example, they say, well, imagine if somebody quoted the dogmatic definition in the Council of Florence and saying there's no salvation outside of the church. We obviously don't believe that anymore, right?
Speak for yourself.
We absolutely do.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, and I mean, just another sign of the fact, and we should probably stop being self-congratulatory after this. But
Sure.
But one last act of self-congratulations, right? The one sign of the fact that this is in fact the correct hermeneutic is the fact that it is exactly and almost verbatim the teaching of one of the earliest doctors of the church, Saint Irenaeus of Lyon, right? Irenaeus says explicitly, the church's teachings do not change; they develop.
Right.
Right. And he uses the kind of organic metaphor of the way that a seed develops into a full-grown plant.
Right. Yeah.
Right. That's the way the doctrine of the church develops. And Irenaeus was only a couple generations away from the apostles. Right. So from one of the earliest doctors of the church to today, this has been the consistent teaching of the church when she reflects on her own development, right? Yeah. Is that it's always developing from a seed into a kind of a full flowering of expression, and it's never a change away from something that she formerly thought or taught. Right.
Like we can develop more distinctions and a greater understanding of sort of the principles that have been taught. But, at no point can a development constitute, well, the church said X, but now not X.
That's right.
It can only say the church said X, let's talk more about what it really means.
Yes.
And so to take as an example there is no salvation outside of the church does not say, well, actually now we understand that, there are some circumstances where somebody can be saved outside of the church. But what the church has done is develop distinctions about like what it really means to be outside of the church versus within the church.
Yep.
Like we can be united to the church by an explicit desire. Mm-hmm. And then one thing that Pius the Ninth talks about is, you can be also united to the church by an implicit desire with, if one is invincibly ignorant of the truths of the gospel. And so like, But
even with all those distinctions, right, which are good, true, valid, and in fact, I think now necessary for us to talk well about this,
right.
It remains the case that if you say the following, there is salvation outside the church, what you are saying is false.
Exactly. Right? Because like what I say is that it's really important to always start from the principle and make distinctions on top of that. If you start with the distinctions, you're going to lose the principle.
That's right.
And that's where I think a lot of people go astray much of the time. But yeah, thank you so much for coming on and chatting with me.
It's been a pleasure.
Yeah, if you like this video, be sure to like, comment, do whatever it is that people of the internet do. And be sure to look up Father Philip Neri Reese, and if you want to donate to the Thomistic Institute,
yes, there's a button on the website.
Yep, there you go. I'll put a link in the description. All right, thank you guys so much, and God bless you.